Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today I have on Madelin Siedler. Madelin is a PhD candidate and researcher focused on exercise physiology, and she recently authored a study titled The Effects of Intermittent Diet Breaks During 25% Energy Restriction on Body Composition and Resting Metabolic Rate in Resistance-Trained Females, a randomized controlled trial. And that's what we're going to kind of dive in today. So thank you so much for coming on today, Madelin.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I think a good kind of starting place for this discussion is just kind of giving an overview of kind of why you wanted to do this study and kind of some background leading into this study.
Absolutely. So when Dr. Campbell and I were first conceiving this study back in 2018, so before I came to Texas Tech for my PhD, I completed my master's in exercise science at University of South Florida with Dr. Bill Campbell. And so one of the things that we had noticed was diet breaks were really all the rage when it comes to the physique world. I had really gotten into exercise science as kind of a natural figure competitor for a while, and that was really what got me into exercise and sports nutrition, and eventually into Dr. Campbell's lab. And so when we were talking about this, we realized that a lot of the research that had been done so far on these kind of intermittent energy restriction approaches were first and foremost, the vast majority of these were looking at fasting approaches. So things like alternate day fasts or the 5-2 diet, where it's technically intermittent, but you're going from periods of total fasting or very, very low energy intake on one day to, much higher energy intake on another day. Sometimes it was, ad libitum, so meaning they just ate whatever they wanted on the feast days, and then they went back to fasting. But there was a lot less research that had been done on kind of more moderate approaches to dieting, the way that you typically see in physique competitors and in kind of the world that we were in. So we really wanted to test out the effects of that type of approach in resistance-trained females. A lot of the research that we did in that lab was looking at, kind of recreationally active, resistance-trained, particular females, because there's just much less research on them. And that same year was the year the Matador study came out, a famous study by Byrne and colleagues that looked at the diet break approach in men with obesity. So we kind of thought, okay, well, let's see what happens if we do a very similar study, but in females who are younger and resistance trained.
Gotcha. So you kind of looked at what's out there and saw that there's kind of a gap in the literature in which, for one, there wasn't a lot of literature on what you might typically see someone do when they're actually going through a fat loss phase of kind of continuously dieting and then kind of taking a little bit of a break and then more of a kind of moderate approach. And then you also saw kind of the Matador study that was in kind of obese men. So you're like, okay, well, what would this look like in kind of a different population, a more kind of moderate approach? Does that sound about right?
That's it.
Perfect. Well, with that, what were you guys kind of, or what was your hypothesis? And then could you kind of get into the methods of how you wanted to go testing that hypothesis?
Yeah. So taking a look at the Matador study, they did find that the men who were randomized to take the 2-week diet breaks after every 2 weeks of dieting, they did have less of a reduction in their resting metabolic rate. So they kind of had a preservation of their metabolic rate through the diet. And they also had greater fat loss efficiency. So they basically lost more fat for every, day or unit of calorie restriction compared to the continuous dieters. So I wasn't so sold on the fat loss effect specifically in, leaner populations who are resistance trained. They just have less fat to lose. I wasn't sure if there'd be really a noticeable effect there, but I was thinking that we could see an effect with the resting metabolic rate, possibly through just a preservation of fat-free mass, or maybe just reducing some of these adaptations you tend to see after the second, third, fourth week of calorie restriction, when, the metabolic rate tends to kind of start to decrease as a way of preserving energy. So I was thinking if we bring these calories back up every couple of weeks, maybe we'll see less of a reduction in the resting metabolic rate and maybe more of a preservation of the fat-free mass as well. So what we did was we took resistance trained females. So they were between the ages of 18 and 35. So generally young, generally healthy, no underlying diseases or disorders. We had them self-attest to resistance training at least twice per week for the past 6 months or more. So these were, recreationally trained. We didn't do any kind of strength testing, that kind of thing, but they had been at least doing some form of resistance training twice a week or more. And then we randomized them to either the control condition, in which they had 6 weeks of a regular 25% reduction in their calorie intake, in addition to being prescribed 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram body mass. So we did want them on a relatively higher protein diet to support their training and support fat-free mass preservation. And then we divided the rest of the calories up between carbs and fats. So either they got that condition or they got the diet break condition, which was every 2 weeks, they took a 1 week diet break. So they had 2 weeks of that 25% calorie restriction with the same, kind of protein per body weight goal and everything else. And then for 1 week, we had them go back up to their old maintenance calories, still eating higher protein, but just basically getting more of their calories from fats and carbs. And then they did that 2 times. So they had 2 week-long breaks during the course of those 6 weeks of energy restriction.
Gotcha. So in the group that did take the breaks, they did 2 weeks dieting, 1 week of maintenance calories, 2 weeks dieting, 1 week maintenance calories. And then was there another 2 weeks of dieting on the back end of that as well?
Yeah. So they finished out the study.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. So it was just 2 weeks longer for this group compared to the group that just did 6 weeks straight through.
Correct. Yep.
And I was going to ask what kind of qualified as resistance trained, but you mentioned that they kind of self-reported that they had been training in the gym for, did you say at least 6 months, for twice a week during those 6 months?
Yeah, they weren't total novices. Yeah. And, we cared about that because we also, this was the first diet break study of its kind to actually also supervise resistance training sessions. So we have a great lab at USF. All of the kind of fun, both powerlifting and also accessory and really fun bodybuilding machines as well. So we also have a wonderful team, about 20 to 25 undergrads and graduate students from the time I was there. So we had plenty of people to help with the training as well. So we had people coming in 3 times a week to do their resistance training during the course of the study as well. So we wanted to make sure that, they were getting their resistance training, they were, they're working hard, they were preserving that muscle. And we also told them, both groups, to do 2 sessions of 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise on their own. We said that can be whatever you want to do, whether that's, treadmill, swimming, cycling, but something that, got their heart rate up, just so that they can have that aerobic component as well. But we didn't supervise those sessions.
Well, I think that gives us a good idea on kind of what you guys did. And one actual follow-up question before we get to the results. When you brought them to their maintenance calories, how did you go about predicting their maintenance calories? Like, did you adjust for body weight, or did you kind of go back to where they were previously at? Or how did you kind of come to those maintenance calories?
Yeah, great question. And I guess I should clarify that the way that we even prescribed their diet calories as well was we had them track everything they ate for a 2-week period. So we taught them how to use MyFitnessPal if they hadn't already. And then we also assigned them to their own diet coach. So one of several members of our lab, some of them are actually, get paid to be physique and strength coaches and do dieting kind of consultations and coaching already. And so we had our participants work with them kind of in email if they had any questions about how to track something, or okay, I'm struggling to get in my protein. What are some ways I can do this? So we had them first just track everything they ate in their regular diet for 2 weeks. And then when we took the averages of their calorie intake and then their macronutrients, we then assigned them a kind of 25% reduction from baseline for their unique baseline level. And for the diet break group, we did just bring them up back to the amount of calories they had been eating at baseline. But again, we had them keep that higher protein prescription during the time they were in their diet breaks as well. So their macros may have looked a little different from baseline, but their calorie intake should look the same. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. I think that provides some helpful context. I think that especially also with a kind of 6-week fat loss phase, I wouldn't expect a super big difference between their kind of original baseline maintenance compared to what it might be, 3 or 4 weeks in. So I think all that sounds good. So with that, I think that now gives us a good kind of understanding of kind of the gap in the literature you were looking to fill, and then also kind of the methods and how you went about having these two different groups dieting for 6 weeks. So now I think we're good to move on to the results and kind of what you guys found with this.
Yeah. So when it comes to the results, we actually found there were no differences in body mass loss, body fat percentage, fat mass or fat-free mass. So both groups, whether they were the control group or the diet break group, they all lost body fat over the course of the diet. They all lost body mass. They generally maintained fat-free mass, so we didn't see any, statistically significant differences in fat-free mass over time, which was very great. And then their resting metabolic rate also stayed the same. So I think on average, there was maybe, a change of about 12 calories per day in their resting metabolic rate. So very minimal, basically, absolutely the same as when they came in. So really on the body composition and metabolism side, you could look at it one of two ways. You could either say, diet breaks don't work because they didn't help them improve how much fat they lost or improve their, changes in resting metabolic rate. But you could also say, hey, if you are not on a schedule, on a tight timeline, right? You have no shows coming up and you're just doing maybe a lifestyle cut or trying to kind of just, get a little bit leaner, you can take diet breaks up to at least a full week every 2 weeks of dieting. And assuming you're taking the same total amount of time to diet, you'll see the same results, which is actually kind of cool too, right? The diet break literature actually came about, this is, 20 years ago now with the Wing and Jeffrey study from 2003. It really came about when they were trying to get people off track of their diet. And they actually found, surprisingly to them, that the people who got the diet breaks actually lost the same amount of weight. So they were surprised because they thought, oh, if we give people the ability to eat all these delicious, highly palatable foods earlier on, they're going to go off track and, gain more weight or maybe just not lose as much, but they actually lost the same. So in a way, that's kind of nice that you have the option of doing diet breaks with no expected, adverse effects in terms of weight loss over time. And then the other thing we looked at was hunger and different kind of eating behaviors. So we did the 3-factor eating questionnaire. So this looks at 3 kind of major eating behavior constructs. So we have hunger, we have cognitive restraint, which is really just the ability to restrain your eating in order to maintain a certain body weight or body shape. And then disinhibition. So disinhibition is the tendency to overeat, either because a food just looks really delicious, or maybe that because you're under stress or kind of emotional eating as well. So, tendency to overeat. Yeah. And so we looked at those 3. We also asked them how hungry they were, how full they were, so their measure of satiety, their motivation to diet for the week ahead, their ease of dieting, so how easy it was for them to diet the past week, and their desire for food, so their desire to eat. And both groups got hungrier and they had more desire to eat over the course of the study. So that should come as no surprise. After 6 weeks of dieting, you'll probably be a little hungrier. But the only difference we saw between the groups was the control group slightly went up in terms of their disinhibition. So that means they probably had a slightly higher tendency to overeat, either in response to stress or just because the food looked really delicious. And the intermittent dieting group, so the diet break group, actually slightly decrease their disinhibition. So they may have had a less of a tendency to overeat. And within those groups, the changes over time weren't statistically significant. But if you compare those changes between the groups over time, there was an interaction effect. So basically, the control group, was more likely to overeat at the end of the study versus the diet break group that was less likely to overeat. So that could be a useful kind of case used for diet breaks, even if they don't help you lose more weight or maintain your resting metabolic rate. If they keep you from overeating after a diet, that could be useful in terms of weight loss maintenance, which is what a lot of people struggle with.
Absolutely. And I like that you kind of looked at both perspectives of kind of the physiological results in which, yes, you didn't really see differences and that point in terms of body composition changes and different things like that between the two groups. And I definitely saw people running both ways with this, in which some people are like, hey, diet breaks are useless. You should never use them. And this study proves it. And then other people are like, hey, they got to the same place. As long as you keep that weight moving down at the same rate, you can take these breaks and kind of work that into an overall diet strategy. So I like that you mentioned that. And then also, it sounds like when looking at overall hunger levels and the desire to kind of overeat and that disinhibition that you mentioned, it does look like that may favor diet breaks kind of slightly to some degree there. And I think that maybe even over the course of a longer fat loss phase, and I'm now speculating outside of what the study showed, but over the course of a longer fat loss phase, that might become more and more important, as a lot of people I found can kind of stick to that 6-week diet. But once we start getting to those 10, 12-week kind of longer diets, maybe that would kind of become more and more important.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, if we had the ability to do a much more extended kind of diet, and especially, it's hard to get research on these folks, but people who are getting to very lean levels for contest prep, et cetera, that's when their bodies are telling them they need to be eating. And so I do think, the chances of seeing those kind of psychological variables and having a bigger effect on those would, I wouldn't be surprised to see that.
Yep, absolutely. So overall, did the kind of results of this study surprise you, or was it kind of more or less in line with what you expected, or did you kind of expect to see a little bit more different results here?
Yeah, I think I expected slightly different results. Again, the body composition changes didn't surprise me just because I didn't think that, given the starting point of having a relatively lean, non-obese participants, I didn't think there'd be, too much difference there in that 6-week diet, and especially giving a very moderate reduction in calories. But I was also surprised to see that resting metabolic rate didn't change at all, even though they lost weight, they lost fat. That may have been just because they were still training really hard. They were maintaining their fat-free mass. So there's no changes there. That surprised me. And I don't think I also expected to see the difference in the disinhibition scores as well. So, that's interesting. Jackson Payos just came out with his diet break paper about a year ago now, and kind of found similar results in like no changes in resting metabolic rate, or no differences in body comp, but these kind of hunger and satiety variables. It's kind of hunger and satiety variables that could bode well for longer term adherence to a diet using a diet break approach.
Absolutely. And for those that don't have the context, Madelin did warn me before we started this podcast that her lights might go out and they occasionally shut off if she doesn't move around enough.
I just got to use more of my hands to talk, I guess. Got to be more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that definitely gives us a good understanding of kind of the results of this study and kind of how it relates to what your expectations were coming in. And I also like that you kind of wrapped it into some other research in this area on what Jackson Pios kind of published about a year ago and different things like that as well. So with that, is there any areas you'd like to see this research go next in terms of kind of diet breaks, or anything that you'd be really interested to see kind of come out in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really think that changes in resting metabolic rate in particular, and in response to different levels of energy restriction, or changes in energy intake or energy balance, are highly variable. So I actually recently, for my comprehensive exam, as part of your journey of becoming a doctorate, you can have the option here at Texas Tech to do a literature review. And so I was assigned to do a 6,000 word literature review on the effects of changes in energy balance on resting metabolic rate. And so it was a really great opportunity for me to really dive deep into that literature. And so what I found was it's not only very highly variable. So some of us, our resting metabolic rate will, just tank after a couple of weeks of dieting. Some of us maintain it much more easily. But there are also kind of what are considered metabolic phenotypes. So we can really generally classify people into either having a thrifty or a spendthrift metabolism. So the thrifty phenotypes tend to lose more of their resting metabolic rate and just lose more energy expenditure when they're in energy restriction. So basically, their bodies are going into hardcore energy conservation mode. Their energy expenditure goes down, their RMR goes down. And over time, if they're trying to diet, we don't want that to happen because it's going to get harder and harder to lose weight. They'll have to cut their calories more and more. And then we have on the other end of that, we have spendthrift metabolisms where they have much less of a reduction in their metabolism when they are in energy restriction. And they also kind of, when they're fasting, we've actually seen increases in their epinephrine. So their bodies are actually kind of increasing energy expenditure for a short period of time. So it's really interesting looking at like the individual differences in how we respond to changes in our energy balance and energy intake. And I would love for this research, and I think a lot of research in exercise science and just science in general is going towards this more individual approach about, okay, how do these individuals respond versus this group, and how can we figure out and predict, whether this intervention is going to work for you or not. So I would love to think that, 10 or 20 years down the line, we'll be able to say, based on XYZ variables, whether diet breaks are a good approach for you or not. So we'll see if that comes to fruition, but I'd love to see a bit more of that kind of inter-individual variability kind of concept when we're looking at these average changes, because they can only really tell you what happened, on the average.
Yep, absolutely. I think that particularly be super interesting, and just anecdotally from coaching clients, you definitely do see a huge variability and it interesting tends to work kind of both ways, in which some people I have to keep continuously raising their calories to keep them to gaining weight in gaining phase. And then often those same individuals, I have to keep cutting calories at pretty quick increments on the way down. And then you have other individuals in which it's like, okay, I put you in an estimated 200 calorie surplus and they just gain weight just almost linearly week after week without much of a change. And then when they go into a fat loss phase, it's like I cut their calories and they just stay there for the next 10 weeks and I don't have to make an adjustment. So I think that would definitely be interesting, and also be interesting to see the interplay between, is one of those kind of phenotypes better for a diet break compared to the other? And does that kind of have an impact on things? I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see more research like that come out. And I don't know, hopefully, maybe I'll even contribute to it. We'll see.
Awesome. If you could boil the study down into a few core takeaways, what would those be?
Yeah. So I would again say, if you have the time and you want a diet break, go for it. But don't expect diet breaks to be a magic bullet, right? So don't expect them to help you maintain your RMR. Don't expect them to help you lose more weight. So again, I don't think maybe they have any physiological benefits that we have seen in this population, but they also have no adverse effects. So if you want to do it, go for it. And that would probably be, the major takeaway I'd say from the study.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one thing to add is that, I think there's probably a little bit of a balance here in which, for certain individuals, maybe diet breaks aren't a good strategy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad for everybody and they can't work. But it's also important to kind of weigh the extra time that it takes to diet break and how long that extends a diet, as well as if you're adding a week-long diet break after every 2 weeks, well, you're potentially doubling the time of a diet in which you could have just dieted straight through for 8 weeks and then got back into a gaining phase and then just increase the amount of time that you spend kind of gaining throughout the year, which might have beneficial effects as well. So I think there's kind of that right balance there, in which absolutely, I think using diet breaks here and there is a good idea, but I would be careful about just extending the diet a ton and kind of try to find a right balance between the two.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And like you said, it is so inter-individual as well. And I know there are some people who say, I've tried the diet break thing and I just felt really hungry and I'd rather just stay on my diet for longer. And to those I say, yeah, just keep dieting then. Again, because no one should feel they need to do diet breaks in order to get any of these benefits. Because it really, we didn't find many. But at the same time, like you said, a couple extra weeks, if you have the time, as long as it doesn't cut into other goals that you may have. I think that's important to take note of.
Yep, absolutely. And that's also a very good point in which I know I've had clients that will say that they're more hungry during a diet break and they almost feel like their propensity to overeat is greater during a diet break because they start eating more kind of tasty foods and everything and then they just want to keep eating those and then it's kind of hard for them to transition back into dieting after eating those foods and those transitions can be difficult for people. So there's definitely kind of more than just a black and white answer here, as with kind of most things.
Yep, always.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. If someone wants to kind of stay up to date with the research you're doing or anything that you're up to, where would be a good place to send them?
Sure. So you can, I guess, always go to my Instagram. It's at madrosefit. So MADROSEFIT. I definitely have a combination of kind of my personal strongman training and just kind of what I do in my life outside of PhD, as well as, I'll always post about the research that I'm reading and also the research I'm working on. Yeah, so you can certainly find me there. And, I should be getting, fingers crossed, hopefully getting a PhD within the next, year and a few months. So in that case, we'll see if I, make my own professional PhD account. But for now, I like to keep it real and show that you can be a PhD student and still keep on top of your training, still keep competing, doing what you love. So that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to kind of link that below. And thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.